Yeah, whenever you're ready. Yeah, sure.
Good evening, folks. Good evening. And in case you're wondering why I'm speaking into a mic, but it doesn't seem to be amplifying my voice, it is recording my voice, but not amplifying my voice. So can everybody hear me at the back? Fabu. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So lovely to see everybody here this evening. I'm Dr. Val-Marie Johnson. I'm the chair of the Department of Social Justice and Community Studies. And I'm also the main faculty liaison for the Lynn Jones Collection. Great honor. And I'm one of the lead organizers for tonight's talk. And I'm just going to speak very briefly. I'd like to begin by recognizing that we're on the unceded territory of the Ilnu or Mi'kmaq people, and the fact that this colonial nation is founded in historic and ongoing dispossession of this land's indigenous peoples and of African and African-descended peoples. I want to thank our sponsors for this evening's talk, the Nova Scotia chapter of the Global African Congress, St. Mary's University's Vice President, Academic and Research and Dean of Arts, St. Mary's Departments of Social Justice and Community Studies, Anthropology, Political Science, and also the Women and Gender Studies MA program. I think that we get a sense of the breadth, depth, and importance of the talk by the range of sponsors. I'm going to very briefly introduce Lynn Jones, who in many ways requires no introduction. And then she is going to introduce Norma Williams and Elle Jones. The mic is off, I think. Okay. Does not appear to be off. Is it working now? Okay. Activist, educator, and community leader, Dr. Lynn Jones. Lifelong labor for her community and social justice has included documenting 5 decades of heritage and culture in the Lynn Jones African Canadian and Diaspora Heritage Collection, which is now housed in the St. Mary's University Archives, as well as immeasurable contributions to anti-racism and labor struggles, too many to even begin to detail, and her current role as chair of the Global African Congress, Nova Scotia chapter, which seeks reparations for the slave trade. One of her recent passions has been organizing the work of producing the first children's book on reparations for the slave trade, which will be officially launched tomorrow morning at the North Memorial Library, and we very much hope that you will join us there tomorrow morning. And the book is also on sale this evening. Errol's holding it up there. If you'd like to get an advance copy, I know I'm bringing mine so I can get autographs of as many children as possible tomorrow morning. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Dr. Lynn Jones.
I have my own mic.
I can just stand right here. Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to see everybody. This is really great. In particular, I bring greetings, of course, from our organization, the Global African Congress, the Nova Scotia chapter. When you're doing this kind of work and trying to mobilize the community, especially on the issue of reparation, it starts out slow, very slowly, and people start talking about, well, what is that all about? And do you just want money? And what about all the other things that go along with it? Tonight, I know that you're here for a special person, so my words are extremely few. But we first of all, I don't think we could go this evening without having invited the activist extraordinaire, poet extraordinaire, educator extraordinaire, previous poet laureate for Nova Scotia. And Elle does this amazing, amazing poem about reparations. So we've asked her if she'll share that tonight. So we'll start with that, and then we'll see where we go from there. Thank you.
Yeah, here.
This is going to be hard.
One thing I forgot is we are live streaming. Harvey's going to tell us what goes along with that.
Oh, okay. If you want to tell your friends and whoever else to watch this live, just tell them go to YouTube/Africentric feed. That's it. All right? That's all I gotta say. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, everybody. Peace. Say peace back to me.
Peace.
Okay, I'm not going to have many hands. This is call and response, so you're going to pick up on the response very quickly, and hopefully I hear it back loud, okay? This poem was actually written during the reparations event that Lynn held at the Halifax North Branch Library about a year ago? 2 years ago. Okay, wow. Okay, so this was written during the event, gathered from what people were saying about reparations. When the transatlantic slave trade built up this entire town, nations founded off our backs, so reparations now. When the rum and cotton sugar was shipping in and out, without black bodies, no economy, so reparations now. All those docks and forts and citadels we built up from a mound. Mountains of black labor, so reparations now. Those tall ships resting in the harbor with Africans chained and bound. Don't forget who benefited from the trade, who owe us reparations now. For the millions of Africans whipped, branded, lynched, and drowned, historical injustice demands reparations now. When the blood of Africans is underfoot and soaked into the ground, that can never be repaid, the least is reparations now. When ads in Halifax newspapers had runaway slaves announced, yes, it happened here in Canada, so reparations now. When they exploited our labor from Birchtown to Freetown, consider it our payment. Reparations now. All those streets and buildings named for Nova Scotian families of renown, profiting off slave labor, so reparations now. Halliburton, Lord Dalhousie supported slavery long and proud. It's in the fabric of this province, so reparations now. You said you'd give us land if we fought loyally for the crown, and then you broke your promise, so reparations now. Just check the Book of Negroes. You even kept a count. We'll make that our starting place for reparations now. When you rioted in Shelburne and burned our houses down, thanks for the museum, but reparations now. When boy and sunshine became our proper nouns, stripped of our humanity, so reparations now. For all the communities we had to build on the rockiest ground, systematic deprivation solved by reparations now. When you told us we had better be white by sundown, terrorized for generations, so reparations now. There's a reason our communities remain poor and run down. Forced us in substandard housing, so reparations now. All the banks that wouldn't loan to someone of our background. Without capital, poor communities, so reparations now. When you tricked us out of title and then built up the land around. Development stolen from our communities, so reparations now. When you forced us into projects with no schools or playgrounds. You created cycles of poverty broken by reparations now. And when you hear the gunshots, know you are hearing the sound of the violence that you caused. You owe us reparations now. You came into Africville and set suitcases of money down and shipped us out in dump trucks, so reparations now. And you leave all our descendants to hustle and to scrounge. Return resources to our communities through reparations now. All those African inventions that you claim that you just found. Intellectual property, so reparations now. All our music, fashion, slang that you stole and just rewound. No appropriation without compensation. Pay us reparations now. When they segregated schools and said black children weren't allowed. Generations without opportunities, so reparations now. When you gentrify our neighborhoods, getting property at discount. For every displaced person equals reparations now. For our children suspended from school, failing and dropping out. You deny us education, so reparations now. And when we get that money, we'll be wearing caps and gowns. Self-determination for our future when we get reparations now. When we're filling up the prisons with skins of black and brown, you're the ones who are the criminals owing reparations now. When the justice system railroads us, it's never underground. Destruction of our communities, so reparations now. police checks and profiling that hector us and hound. For all the violations, you owe reparations now. When you try to buy our communities with fake apologies, lockdown, apology not accepted. Reparations now. You think you can exploit us and we won't make a sound? We will never stop demanding reparations now. When you bulldoze our churches, disturbing bodies in their shrouds, our ancestral spirits will haunt you for our reparations now. Don't think we don't see you living high on land our bodies plowed. We're coming for our compensation owed in reparations now. We've been battered, bruised, and beaten, but our heads remain unbowed. We're demanding more than just survival. Give us reparations now, or there'll be a revolution. Just like Marx and Che and Mao, we'll rise up and take it back. Expect our reparations now.
Powerful, powerful.
Wow, sends chills. I can still remember that Elle wrote this reparations poem literally on the spot. She was there for the whole event of us developing our plans, talking about what reparations would look like, and she just moved around the room. And at the end of the day, this is what she came up with.
Brilliant.
So it's absolutely fantastic. At this time, I'd actually like to introduce a guest in the audience, and that is my niece, Denise. Reverend Denise Gillard, who is here from Toronto, and she is the editor, the one that puts together all the little pieces of the book and how we're going to go about actually making this fabulous R's for Reparations happen. So stand up and take your bow, Denise, for all the work on this. And many of you know my sister Marie, who's sitting from her, who also came to accompany her from Toronto. At this time, I know that you all came to hear our esteemed speaker this evening. So I'll call on another member of our Global African Congress, Norma Williams, who is, where is she? Oh, she's over here. In the office of the president at Dalhousie University, one of our newer members. And by the way, people keep asking, like, this Global African Congress, Nova Scotia chapter. And one of the things that we've adopted is the fact that we who have decided and adopt and have within our heart the fact that we are due reparations, and that we in Nova Scotia have suffered as a result of the Atlantic slave trade, colonialism, anti-racism, and all of these things. You're all members. Anybody that's looking for that, you're all members of the Global African Congress. So I'll call on Norma now to introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I am so happy to be here. This is something that, as part of the organization, we have worked on for a while, and we're so pleased that you, David Commission, are here this evening to speak with us and to us. As part of introduction, David Commission has been attorney at law for decades in Barbados. He's a former senator and has been crucial to the founding and leading the People's Empowerment Party, the Clement Payne movement, and the Pan-African movement of Barbados, the Global African Congress, the Barbados Government Commission for Pan-African Affairs, and the Caribbean Pan-African Network. Mr. Commisiong was a member of the Barbados Government National Task Force on Reparation and currently coordinates the Caribbean chapter of the International Network in Defense of Humanity and the newly established Caribbean Peace Movement, and serves as Barbados ambassador to the 15 Nations Caribbean Community and the Association of Caribbean States. He is the author of multitude books as well, including It's the Healing of a Nation, The Case for Reparations. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Commisiong.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I don't think I need a mic, right? Mr. Technician? No? Okay. I think silence is no. Let me say what a pleasure it is to be here. My first time in Nova Scotia. It's a bit cold, so I'm looking forward to coming back in the summer when I can really explore the landscape and see all the little towns. I want to thank the Global African Congress chapter of Nova Scotia and Miss Lynn Jones. And actually, much of what I'm going to be saying, talking about this evening, stems from, I don't know if I want to call it a challenge, but when I first met Lynn Jones at the founding of the African American National Reparations Congress, after we went back to our respective homes, she contacted me and asked me, could I provide a sketch, an outline of exactly what is expected of an individual reparationist, a person who says they're involved in reparations. What exactly do they do, or should they be doing? So she caused me to think, and I began to try to systematize my thought by looking at principles that should govern the reparations campaign. So she probably doesn't know it, but she's the inspiration for much of what I'm going to say tonight. So my talk is towards an understanding of reparations as a creative, holistic, and powerful tool of Black liberation. I think that it would be useful, since you would have heard in the introduction a lot about my Caribbean credentials, that maybe I should speak a little bit about what the Caribbean is doing in relation to this reparations cause. The Caribbean was very deeply involved in the United Nations World Conference Against Racism that was held in Durban, South Africa in the year 2001. At that time, I was the chairman and director of the Barbados government's Commission for Pan-African Affairs, so I was very much involved with all of the Barbados governmental delegations working on the World Conference. And back then, we recognized that this was an historic opportunity to put the issue of reparations firmly on the international agenda. And so we mobilized to do so. And we were relatively successful. Out of the Durban conference came the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. And in that document, you will see the transatlantic slave trade, slavery declared a crime against humanity. You will see a justification made in those documents for apologies, for reparations. I must tell you, though, that one of the countries that really resisted those resolutions at the time was your own country, Canada. Canada, the United States, you know. And the truth is, most of the white Western countries, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand. So you had the rest of the world on one side supporting this cause because it's such a just and righteous cause. Anybody who hears the history recognizes automatically the justice and righteousness of the cause. So we had no difficulty having Asiatic countries come on board as allies, Latin American countries come on board as allies, but the countries of Western Europe, United States, Canada, Australia found it difficult to acknowledge the justice and righteousness of this claim to reparations. But some very important work was done at Durban, and Durban is very important because it laid the groundwork for future developments. The future development I most want to stress is one that occurred in the year 2013. Just to give you the background, in the Caribbean, we have a collective organization of 15 nations known as the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM. Those nations stretch from Suriname in the south, it's part of the South American mainland, Suriname and Guyana, right up the chain of islands, Trinidad, Grenada, St. Vincent, Barbados, St. Lucia, right up, Dominica, Haiti. All of the territories are English-speaking, with the exception of Suriname, which is Dutch-speaking, and Haiti, which is French-speaking, all the way up to Jamaica, the Bahamas, and then across to Central America, Belize. So those territories make up the Caribbean Community. It's been in existence since 1973. And in 2013, the heads of government of the CARICOM countries came together and made a momentous decision. They decided that CARICOM was going to pursue a reparations claim for native genocide, the genocide of the indigenous people of the Caribbean. I come from an island that we call Barbados, but the original name is Ichiruganaim. That is the name given to it by the indigenous people. The indigenous people used to live there. Right now, there are no indigenous people in Barbados. They were totally wiped out. So reparations for native genocide and for African enslavement. So that they made that momentous decision, and they were going to pursue this claim against the European colonizing powers, Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, all of whom were implicated in enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade. They also decided that each of the CARICOM member states would be mandated to establish a national governmental reparations committee or task force. So 12 of the member states established these national committees. They decided that overarching those national committees would be a CARICOM Reparations Commission. It has a chairman, a Barbadian, who just happens to be the vice chancellor of our University of the West Indies, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. And the chairpersons of each national committee are members of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. They also decided that over the entire body, at the apex of the body, they would establish a committee of prime ministers. And that committee of prime ministers would be chaired by the Prime Minister of Barbados. So there's a prime ministerial subcommittee on reparations. Under it, the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Under that, all of the national governmental committees. And then it was subsequently decided that we would establish a CARICOM Reparations Research Center. So that was established in 2017, and that's located at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. So that's the structure that we put in place. They decided that we would pursue an approach to the European nations based on reason, that we would write to all of the heads of government of the relevant European countries, informing them that we were pursuing this claim, and that we wanted to sit with them to discuss it in, against the background of principles of justice and restitution, and setting the stage for a brighter future. So they wrote to all of the then heads of government. This would be in 2016. I must tell you that I've read the letters that were written back in response, and there is no head of government of any of these European countries that frontally acknowledged the claim for reparations and accepted the request to sit down and discuss. They all acknowledged how wrong slavery was, what a terrible episode in the history of humanity, how much it was to be regretted, that it must never happen again, that they were committed to preserving the dignity of victims, etc., etc., etc. But they all sidestepped the simple request that we sit at a table, heads of government of the Caribbean, the heads of government of Europe, and discuss a reparations package. And bear in mind that the CARICOM approach to a reparations package was not really centered around a money payment. It was centered around developmental program. But I'll tell you the 10-point action plan that the CARICOM Reparations Commission and the heads of state came up with. They said the first thing must be a full, formal apology. Secondly, that we must sit down and discuss the issue of repatriation, because there's a significant component of the African Caribbean population that wish to physically return to the African continent. Principally leading that charge is the Rastafarian community. So they said we need to talk about those Afro-Caribbean people who wish to repatriate and what resources would be required to facilitate such repatriation. Number 3 was an indigenous peoples development program. Although most of our indigenous people were totally wiped out, we still do have remnants of that population in Dominica, in St. Vincent, in Guyana, in Suriname, in Belize. Fourth, cultural institutions. They made the point that that history within the Caribbean has never been properly documented, has never been properly presented to the Caribbean people, to Caribbean educational institutions, and that there was a need for properly equipped cultural institutions to do justice to that story. Fifthly, health, that there's a public health crisis in the Caribbean that is rooted in those centuries of enslavement. The Caribbean is the headquarters, the world headquarters for diabetes and hypertension, diseases that are related to living in highly stressed environments and poor diet. So the Caribbean people are people who were taken from the continent of Africa. But when you do the health profile of African people in the Caribbean versus African people on the continent, there's a big disparity in terms of chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension. So they were saying, look, part of the reparations must be a program in health. Illiteracy education, an African knowledge program. They spoke about the need, in addition to illiteracy eradication and educational development, also an African knowledge program that the African people of the Caribbean's experience of their mother continent has been truncated, and that needs to be repaired. Technology transfer, debt cancellation, and psychological rehabilitation. That the trauma that for over 400 years, Africans and their descendants were classified in law as non-human, chattel, property, and real estate. They were denied recognition as members of the human family by laws derived from the parliaments and palaces of Europe. This history has inflicted massive psychological trauma upon African descendant populations. This much is evident daily in the Caribbean. Only a reparatory justice approach to truth and educational exposure can begin the process of healing and repair. Such an engagement will call into being, for example, the need for greater Caribbean integration designed to enable the coming together of the fragmented community. Subsequent to this, they also added the component of, yes, a reparations fund, an actual fund of money that could be used to finance reparations projects. But as I said, we have the writing of the letter and the invitation to discuss has not had a ready response. So we are now talking about putting together a team of lawyers. We have the Reparations Research Center that is expected to lead the research effort into the reparations claim. We need a team of lawyers to begin looking at a legal case and how do we mount a legal case. And so this is where we are at in CARICOM so far as the reparations campaign is concerned. I think that this is just a beginning. I have done a paper for my prime minister. We had elections in Barbados last year, so we now have a new Barbados prime minister who has taken over chairmanship of the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations. So since I am the ambassador to CARICOM, I would be expected to work closely on that reparations campaign. I believe that we have to put the infrastructure in place to permit us to carry through this campaign successfully. What we are trying to do is something massive, and we are taking on some of the most powerful forces on the planet, the governments of Western Europe. Therefore, we have to think very seriously about what kind of infrastructure will be required to carry through such a massive mission successfully. So I am putting a case that, we must bring on board our ministries of foreign affairs. We must have a diplomatic strategy. All of our embassies, our high commissions, our ambassadors at the United Nations and the Organization of American States and the Commonwealth. We must bring on board our universities, our ministries of education, and we must also expand. We must expand the campaign way beyond the confines of the Caribbean. We must look for allies, not only in the black world, but also in the European and North American countries. So that is just to give you a sense of where the Caribbean is, and the leadership that has come from CARICOM. The CARICOM initiative is very important because it is, for the first time, we now have sovereign national governments taking up the reparations cause. We have always had civil society organizations, Pan-Africanist organizations, activists, but now we have national governments. National governments that have seats at the UN and in international fora. National governments that can deploy national institutions. This is very important. And in fact, since this CARICOM initiative emerged in 2013, it has inspired a renewed interest in reparations internationally. It has inspired, for example, in the United States, the establishment of the African American National Reparations Commission. We have been speaking to the members of the Congressional Black Caucus in the United States, for example. So in Brazil, in other parts in Africa, in other parts of the world, people are once again sitting up and taking notice of this reparations cause. Now, as I said, my topic is to argue that reparations is a creative, holistic, and powerful tool of black liberation. Now, let me say that when we make a case for reparations, what we are saying is, look, whenever you can determine that genocide or a crime against humanity has been committed, international law tells you that the consequences of those criminal acts must be repaired, that there must be compensation. So reparations is about international law. Yes, it's about morality, it's about ethics, but at the core, it is about international law. So what do we mean by a crime against humanity? Well, the Nuremberg Charter defines it as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population, whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country where perpetrated. If you look at the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the associated system of racialized chattel slavery, you see multiple crimes against humanity. Genocide, the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines genocide as follows, quote, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So, again, when you look at the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the associated system of racialized chattel slavery, multiple genocides. For 400 years of genocide. And international law says where crimes against humanity and genocides have been committed, there's no statute of limitations. Right? They can be prosecuted at any time. So the claim for reparations is based on the existence of crimes against humanity and genocide. And it is on that foundation that we build the claim for reparations. Reparations is therefore extremely important, not only for African people, but for the whole of humanity, because reparations sends a fundamental message. And the fundamental message is that there will be no impunity for the commission of crimes against humanity. You commit the crime, you think you have gotten away with it. 100 years might pass, 200 years might pass, but we are here to tell you that there's no impunity. If we have to wait 200 years to bring you to the bar of justice, the day of reckoning is coming. So there's no impunity for crimes against humanity. And this, for me, is the first principle of reparations, that we are sending a message to the entire world. When the African people say that we are holding you accountable and we are demanding reparations now for the transatlantic slave trade and the crimes that you committed in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, we are sending a message that there is no impunity for criminality, no matter how long it takes. It's very, very important. So, if for no other reason than that, reparations is a good thing, is a campaign that should be supported. Secondly, reparations is a validation by us of our intrinsic and sacred humanity. Because if it were possible for institutions, nations, people to commit the most horrendous crimes imaginable against our ancestors, and we, their descendants, when we are in a position to demand justice, if we do nothing, if we do not make that demand, what message are we sending to ourselves and to the world? The message we would be sending is, we do not consider that our ancestors were sacred beings deserving of justice and dignity. So the mere act of demanding reparations is a validation by us of our own humanity, of the humanity of our ancestors, and by extension of our humanity as well. We are validating it to ourselves, but we are also validating it to the entire world. And you know, when we think about reparations, for us it is a twofold process. There's an outward element to reparations, but there's also an inward element. There's an outward element in which we level a claim at those national governments, those institutions that are liable for those crimes. So there's an outward element where we level that claim. We are demanding compensation. We are demanding reparation. But then there's also an inward movement where, because reparations is about repair. To repair. How do we repair damage that has been caused? Well, there's an element of the damage that we have to look within to find. That element of the damage that most intimately relates to our culture and our psyches. So we see elements of the damage in, for example, you go to places in the Caribbean and you see people who bleach their skins. Black people, African people who bleach their skins. That is a symptom of the damage that has been done. That's a symptom of hundreds of years of an ethos of white superiority and black inferiority. Reparations says we also, there's a component of reparations that requires us to look within to identify any vestige of psychological damage or deficiency that we need to identify and to deal with. So, as I said, my sister Lynn encouraged me to think about the principles of our reparations movement. And in thinking about those principles, it occurred to me that, look, that inward component of our reparations struggle is extremely important, because we are not going to be successful in our quest for reparations unless it becomes a mass movement. It can't be a restricted movement of governments and a few activists. We have to make it a mass movement. But in order for us to make it a mass movement, we have to give our people a knowledge of their history. So the reparations campaign is really founded upon, first of all, knowledge, information. We must be committed to giving our people a knowledge of who we Africans or African descendants were as a people before the criminal European impositions of slavery and colonialism. So we must know our pre-colonial, pre-slavery African civilizations. We must have that knowledge. We must know about the European invasion of Africa, the slave trade, the depredations. We must know Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, how Europe's industrial development was purchased at the expense of Africa's underdevelopment. We must know this history. We must know that the triangular trade, although we really shouldn't be calling it a trade because it wasn't really a trade, but that triangular process, industrial manufacture in Britain, goods taken to the west coast of Africa, enslaved human beings taken across the Atlantic to plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas, sugar, cotton, and other products taken back to Europe to be used in the mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire. The way in which that triangular mechanism built the European industry, European banking, the European insurance industry, the European merchant marine, the canal system in Britain. I mean, virtually that powerful Western industrialized civilization that we know today, the engine for it was that transatlantic trade in human beings. That's just the reality, but our people need to know that. They need to know that history. So we are saying, as part of that inward process, we must teach our people our history. We must deal with that aspect of self-repair, where we look within, where we must look within with the objective of identifying any lingering vestige of false notions of white superiority and black inferiority, and we must remove them from ourselves. And by indulging in that education and that self-repair, we will generate the mass support among our people for reparations. Our people will begin to get a sense of the loss, of the tremendous loss that we have experienced as a people, what we had before, what we lost, and be motivated to be part of the reparations struggle. So this is why I say it is a creative and holistic tool, instrument of black liberation. It's not just about demanding a money payment. Usually when you hear black people opposing reparations, it's because they have that stereotypical notion that it's simply about a demand for a money payment. No. No. It's much more holistic, multifaceted, creative, and powerful than that. It is a tool that it is an instrument that we can use in a multiplicity of ways to solve our problems and to liberate ourselves. For me, another principle of reparations is that it is all about completing the emancipation process. Because we know that when the European powers, when Britain, for example, said it was abolishing slavery between 1834 and 1838, we know that that was not the end of the oppression of our people. We know that those now former slave masters, slave owners, went on to concoct a whole variety of mechanisms that were consciously designed to hold back our people, to continue to exploit and repress our people. I mean, in Barbados, we know the story well. As soon as slavery was abolished, they passed something called the Masters and Servants Act. The Masters and Servants Act was designed to tie the ex-slave to the plantation. And so you lived on the plantation. If you were under the contract you had with the plantation, you were obligated to provide labor only to that plantation. And if you neglected to turn up for a day's work, and you didn't have the right excuse, you could be taken before the magistrate. You could be convicted of an offense. You could be beaten. You could be imprisoned. The Masters and Servants Act. So, and we know the story. So we know that the abolition of slavery was not the end of our oppression. And we know that many of the new mechanisms that were put in place to continue to oppress and repress our people still exist in modified form even up to today. So part of the reparations campaign is to examine the current reality of our societies with a view to determining whether any of those mechanisms still exist, to identify them, to name them, and to take action to dismantle them. So when they tell you that reparations is about something in the past, no. It is very much about the here and now. One of the fundamental principles of the reparations movement is that it is about completing the emancipation process. So again, reparations is a creative instrument that we must deploy for our liberation. Okay? And another principle of reparations. Reparations must produce the just society. I'll read it from this. The fifth fundamental principle of the reparations movement is that the campaign for reparations or for reparative justice must be designed to produce the just society, in that the demand for reparations must be formulated as a demand for a fundamental transformation of the currently existing inequitable and exploitative economic and power relations that exist in the international arena and in many of our domestic societies. So when we say we are pursuing reparations, we are not pursuing international aid. We are not pursuing some window dressing. We are talking about a fundamental restructuring of structurally oppressive and inequitable structures. We are talking about a movement that must aim at producing the just society, not only nationally, but internationally. And I give some examples. For example, it should be noted that this principle has implications not only for the restructuring of such international entities and phenomena as the United Nations Security Council, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the terms of international trade and finance, but also for the manner in which our domestic societies and governments function. Implicit in the demand of our Caribbean and African governments for reparations must be a commitment to themselves deliver justice to their own people. And this is a commitment that the masses of African and Caribbean people must be prepared through dynamic activism and advocacy to hold our governments to. So in other words, I'm saying that as we talk about producing the just society, it has implications for how we restructure all of those major international institutions that right now exclude African people or marginalize African people. But it even has implications for our own black governments. Because the government of Barbados or the government of Jamaica cannot tell me that it is pursuing a reparations campaign for black people in relation to European governments, while at the same time doing injustice to its own African citizens. So if you commit to a campaign for reparations, you're committing for a campaign based on justice. Justice for African people. That has implications for you too. Barbados government, you too. It has implications for how you behave in relation to your own African Barbadian citizens. So again, it is an instrument that the African people must use, must deploy in a very creative and powerful way to secure our own liberation. The sixth principle for me, no one must be left behind. Let me read this one. A fundamental objective of the reparations campaign must be to ensure that no African descendant is left behind in a slavery-like condition of poverty and powerlessness. You see, Our enslaved African ancestors were all brought to the so-called New World against their will as an undifferentiated human collective, and were all deposited at the very bottom of a structure of exploitation and dispossession. They all therefore shared a common predicament and engaged in a common struggle to survive and to extricate themselves from the imposed condition. We all came in the bottom of a slave ship. All right? Over the years, some of us have been more fortunate than others and have managed to remove ourselves from the bottom slavery-like conditions of the prevailing social order. But there are still many of us who continue to exist in slavery-like conditions of poverty. And so our resolve must be to not leave any black sister or brother behind in such a condition. The fundamental mission of the reparations campaign must therefore be to provide resources, mechanisms, and programs that reach out to every sister and brother who still finds herself or himself in a slavery-like condition of poverty, and to lift him or her out of that mire. Like every good kinship group or army platoon, we must be resolved not to leave any member of our fraternity behind. And you know, when that insight came to me, just walking in Barbados and seeing a black Barbadian woman sitting in front of this dilapidated hut that was her house. And she's dressed in a very rudimentary kind of gown. And I just looked at her, and I was seeing an image of the condition of our people 150 years ago. And it came to me that fundamentally, the overarching principle of reparations is that, look, all of us were brought here in that condition. We all engage in a collective struggle. We are not leaving anybody behind. The fundamental overarching principle of reparations is that we are going to use reparations to reach back and provide a hand to lift up every brother and sister. Again, how do we use reparation in a creative, holistic manner to liberate ourselves individually, but also collectively? And the other principles I have here, I'll just mention them. Africans must exercise autonomy throughout the process. That principle emerged when looking at the CARICOM reparations program, where they placed an emphasis on developmental cooperation with these governments. Yes, fine. We can have that developmental cooperation, provided we understand that we must exercise autonomy throughout the process. So yes, we can cooperate with the government of Britain on an educational initiative or a health initiative. But let it be understood, at every stage, we must be the ones to exercise control and autonomy over whatever the collaboration is. Also, that compensation must be proportionate to the crime. And this is very important. We must insist on a reparations package that is proportionate to the crime committed and the injury inflicted. You know, in 1834, the British government did a calculation of the value, the money value of the 800 and something thousand enslaved human beings that existed in the British Empire at that time. And they came up with a value of 47 million pounds. They said these human beings were valued at 47 million pounds. And they said that, okay, the planters, since we are requiring you to give these human beings freedom, we are going to compensate you for your loss of property. We, the British Parliament, we are going to pay you a lump sum of 20 million pounds. The other 27 million pounds, we are going to require the newly freed people to pay themselves through an 8-year period of so-called apprenticeship, where although they are free, they will be obligated to give you a certain number of hours of free work every week for 8 years. At the end of that 8 years, the value of that free work would be valued at 27 million pounds. So you would, at the end of the 8 years, you would have gotten the entire value of your property, the full 47 million pounds. Now, at the time, the 20 million pounds was equivalent to 40% of the total annual budget of the British government. Professor Nicholas Draper of the University of London has calculated that in today's values, that 20 million pounds is equivalent to 76 billion pounds. 76 billion pounds. The British government, 76 billion pounds, for 76 billion pounds is the equivalent, in their calculation, the value of human beings, of one generation of enslaved workers, of less than half the value, because remember, they calculated the entire value at 47 million. So the 76 billion pounds is less than a half of the value of one generation of enslaved workers. Now, slavery existed, British slavery existed in the Caribbean for 250 years. So you're talking about not one generation, you're talking about multiple generations. Now this 20 million pounds or 47 million pounds is how they put a value on a human being. The labor of a human being has nothing now to do with loss of life, has nothing to do with the whippings, the mutilations, the rapes, the starvings, the burning at the stake. It has nothing to do with all of those injuries, those personal injuries, the loss of life. You know, I mean, the catalog of horrors is just overwhelming, even to try to take it in. You know, I often tell people, look, you know, the concentration camp did not begin in Nazi Germany. The first concentration camps were in places like Barbados. Those were the first concentration camps. That's what the slave plantation was. And it was a place in which, you know, they calculated, we invest in a human being, we purchase a human being. If we work that human being to death in 6 years, we will make X times our investment. They created a system of super exploitation of labor designed to generate a super abundance of profits. And from little Barbados in the 17th century came the first billionaire class of Europe, the first billionaire class. You know, they experimented with it, they perfected it, a system designed for the super exploitation of labor to generate a superabundance of profits. And what we need to understand is that sugar in the 17th century is like what cocaine and heroin is today. You know, the first time these people are tasting the sweet thing. So coffee and tea and chocolates and jams and this sugar, you never had sugar before. It was an addictive substance. So it spread like wildfire. It's like what an illegal drug is today. And it generated a superabundance of profits. Little Barbados was more valuable in the 17th century, was more valuable to the British Empire than New York, Pennsylvania, you know, about 4 of the American colonies put together. 4 of the American colonies, the 13 colonies put together. Little Barbados, right? And so we are saying compensation must be proportionate to the crime. I mean, you paid slave masters 76 billion pounds in 1834. It never occurred to you that if you're going to compensate people, that it's the enslaved people to be compensated. You compensate the slave masters. Anyhow, I know my time is limited, so reparations must be a broad movement. The mass of our people must be intimately involved. We will ultimately have to network and establish a new international legal structure. Either we will sit down around a table and negotiate this reparations claim, or it will have to be litigated. If it has to be litigated, I believe that you probably are going to have to set up a special international legal mechanism to litigate a claim of this magnitude. And this is why I think that we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do at the level of international diplomacy, because ultimately, if we have to litigate it, probably through the United Nations, we are going to have to set up a special tribunal capable of litigating a claim of that magnitude. Lynn Jones asked me, what should be the mission of an individual committed to pursuing reparation? So I've come up with a term. I've come up with a category called African reparationists. And I am saying to persons, you must become an African reparationist. And if you become an African reparationist, this is what is required of you. Number 1, acquire a knowledge of our history and engage yourself in spreading that information and teaching it to our people and to our potential allies. That's your first task as an African reparationist. 2, acquire the training and expertise to equip you to help our people to engage in critical self-examination and psychological reconstruction. Thirdly, if you're an African reparationist, lead or catalyze or lend support to campaigns based on identifying still existing racially discriminatory practices or structures and dismantling them. Fourthly, engage in reparations outreach campaigns to such organizations as trade unions, churches, political parties, schools, youth organizations, community-based organizations, to encourage them to put support for reparations into their programs, manifestos, and agendas. 5, organize or facilitate or participate in groundings, so like community meetings with our people based on discussing 1, the extent of the damage done to us, 2, the need for a program of repatriation, 3, the type and amount of compensatory resources to be claimed, and 4, how these resources will be administered. 6, African reparationists, build contacts and relationships with other African reparationists and the various institutions of our international African reparations infrastructure. 7, contribute to preparing, filing, and prosecuting reparations law cases and campaigns of mass activism, including consumer boycotts against relevant companies and institutions. And finally, spread and inculcate the notion or ideology that we African people came across the Middle Passage as an undifferentiated, dispossessed mass of people in the bottom of a slave ship, and we are committed to not leaving any brother or sister behind in slavery-like conditions of poverty and powerlessness. So, in answer to Lynn Jones's request, what should an individual reparations activist be engaged in? I want to offer to you my definition of an African reparationist and an 8-point program for an African reparationist to pursue. So I'll end there and hopefully open up for questions and talk a little bit more. Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't know if somebody's going to chair. Or, yeah. Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, no problem. Not a problem. Oh, boy.
Whoever's asking a question would like you to hold the mic so that we get the question recorded. Okay? You want me to take the mic around? Oh, yeah. There's some hands up there.
Hello? Oh, it's just recording. Okay, so I don't have to speak into the mic then. All right. Thank you, David, for your talk. It's very enlightening. I want to pick up on your last point, point 8, and it has to the task of the African reparationists and that we all came as an undifferentiated mass. And we actually, if you may recall, started this conversation last year in Regina when you were the keynote at the Black Canadian Studies Conference. And our theme last year in Regina was reparations, and David was our keynote. And we one of these discussions was about how you apply that to Canada. I'm gonna even narrow it down further to say Nova Scotia, because within Nova Scotia, you may or may not know, there is a historical Black communities, and then there are other communities, Caribbean, African, but even though the communities are intermarrying and are mixing with each other. But at the same time, the DPAD, and the DPAD is Decade for People of African Descent that was promulgated by the United Nations. The DPAD work in Nova Scotia at the moment includes only Black Nova Scotians from the historical community. It would seem to me, when the working group came here from the United Nations, only people from the historical community, it seems to me, were interviewed. Nonetheless, that may or may not be the case, but because of these different, so your point about that we all came as this undifferentiated mass, it really speaks to me, because what I see happening now is not that collective security, as Bob Marley would say, but you know, certain people are being marginalized. Caribbean people who have been here 50, 60, 70 years, African people who have been here as long, doesn't seem to be part of these. I wouldn't say they don't seem to be part of the discussion, because they are, because some of these discussions have actually been initiated by them. And so your point about being unity, and that this thing will not work unless we have a broad-based unity, and that everybody comes to the table, it really speaks to me. And I do acknowledge, I'm one of the first people to acknowledge the specificities and the uniqueness of the historical Black communities in Nova Scotia. But what I see happening with the whole DPAD thing that's being rolled out is the kind of marginalization of certain Black communities, which will not help anybody.
Okay. What I would say, let me respond first. Yeah. There's a book called The Black Diaspora by Ronald Siegel. Anybody knows that book? Yeah, The Black Diaspora. Ronald Siegel is a South African, a white South African, but very much committed to the Black struggle. In fact, he had to flee for his life from South Africa, and has written extensively on the Black experience on the continent and in the diaspora. And it's a brilliant book, The Black Diaspora. And in that book, he looks at all of the diaspora societies, including Canada. And the point he makes about Canada, he says that Canada is the most divided Black diaspora society of them all. That in Canada you find French-speaking Blacks, English-speaking Blacks. You find divisions between Blacks from the different English-speaking Caribbean islands. You say you find a plethora of either Barbadian, Jamaican, St. Lucian associations. You find a division between, even in French-speaking, between those who came from Haiti versus those who came from Martinique and Guadeloupe versus those who came from Francophone Africa. You find those who came from the United States versus those who came from Africa versus those who came from the Caribbean. And he says that it is the most, of all the diaspora societies, it is the most divided. And of course, those in Nova Scotia, the traditional, versus those who came more recently, very, very divided. So that, to me, that is one characteristic of Canada. Another characteristic of Canada for me is that the Black community here has to be the most highly educated and trained Black community in the globe, in any part of the world. And I know this, I haven't done the study, but simply based on Canada's immigration policies, Canada has the most restrictive immigration policy, where for a Black person to enter Canada as an immigrant, you have to be a person of a certain educational standard, etc. And therefore, I know that Canada, the Afro-Canadian population has to be the most highly educated Black population anywhere in the world. So, that says to me that this population has a very special responsibility. Because you can't be the most highly educated black people on the planet and don't expect that with that comes certain responsibilities. Certain responsibilities come with that. But probably for Canada to realize that tremendous potential and to live up to those responsibilities, it will probably have to heal or bridge some of those divisions. It will have to bridge some of those divisions. And you know, reparations is the quintessential bridging mission, because if it's a campaign that all of us share in common. Now, you have a very unique reparations situation in Canada. It's much more complicated than us in the Caribbean. In Barbados, our campaign is clear. We have a black government made up of from our prime minister, all our ministers, everybody back down are descendants of ex-slaves, right? So we are pursuing a reparations claim against Britain, the national government of Britain. You have a claim against the British government. You have a claim against the French government. You have a claim against the United States government. You have a claim against the Canadian government.
Yes.
So, and then you have to make a differentiation between the Canadian experience in the colonial period versus the colonial experience from 1867. You have to examine the extent to which crimes and criminal structures that were established in the colonial period were carried forward into the independence period. So you have a lot of work to do. You have a lot of work to do. And this is why Canada needs, Nova Scotia needs a reparations commission. Probably every province in Canada should have a reparations commission to look at the specificity of the province. And then there needs to be a national reparations commission, because you have a lot of work to do. Now, the beautiful thing about reparations, because I don't think any of us are claiming individual reparations. When we say reparations, we are not saying I am claiming some individual sum of money for myself. No, we are talking about a societal transformation. We are talking about removing structural obstacles to black progress. We are talking about removing structural victimization of dark-skinned people and African people. We are talking about undoing the effects of a past of repression and restriction. So, when we achieve reparations breakthroughs, they are going to benefit all black people, all African people. Because even if we want to get into the invidious task of quantifying which set of black people, which group of black people suffered more than others, it doesn't even matter. Because at the end of the day, whoever suffered most or suffered less, at the end of the day, when we break down structures and mechanisms of black exploitation, black oppression, all black people will benefit. As I say, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. All will benefit. So I think that to the extent that Canada does, because of its variety of so many subgroups of Africans here, which is a strength, is definitely a strength, but could also be a weakness. But of course, if you are able to unify the groups, then it is an unmitigated strength. There then is no weakness in it, period. And it then unleashes you to deploy the education and training you have to play a role not only to uplift black people here, but to play your rightful role in helping to uplift African people internationally.
Absolutely.
So I would just urge that as we pursue the reparations campaign, it is going to ineluctably bring that bonding and that uniting.
That's it. Good. Thank you. Unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes left.
Oh, boy.
So as you ask your questions, because there's a lot of hands that are up at this present time, that you not do too much prefacing, that you just ask your question. But no, I actually have a list. But before we do that, just for a clarification in the last comment, and for those of you that don't know, because we throw around sometimes acronyms and what have you, DPAD stands for Descendants of People of African Descent. And we have an organization here that's kind of like an umbrella made up of several organizations. It's relatively new, and we're building. We actually have membership. It's an open membership for not only organizations, but also individuals. So we have membership from the Caribbean community, the African community, the Latin American community, the local community. So that spreads throughout everybody. So, and it's wide open, so you can join. We recognize many people don't belong to organizations, so they're welcome to join. I had this young man here that had his hand up first. So we're going to go there first, and then...
So, all the questions, yeah, answer at the end. Yeah, at the end.
That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you need paper? Here's a pen.
Want me to speak to the mic?
So ask your question.
Yeah, I got a pen. I have a pen.
Okay.
My question was, when you talk of reparations and some of the things that you pointed out, it almost entails that you, as someone who suffered under various forms of oppression, are trying to appeal to the conscience of the oppressor. Isn't that already like a fruitless pursuit? Because the mere presence that one is a oppressor or a descendant in some way means that he or she perhaps does not have a conscience. So is that not a fruitless pursuit in itself?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. David, and I want to refer to Dr. Cooper's comments. I agree with her. I'm old Nova Scotian, but I see reparations and the reparations movement as a tool to eradicate that division within our communities. As you said early on in your talk, that we must educate ourselves first. But my question is, in terms of what needs to be done, it's massive. Are our African countries prepared to give us resources that we lack here in the diaspora in our struggle for reparations?
Who else has a microphone?
African countries.
I'll be quick. Name is Ifo. British invaded us, and I'm Isoko. I have just a couple of things. One from a Haitian brother who's watching the live stream, who said you should remember Spain, because they also stole a whole bunch of stuff.
Remember who? Spain, yeah.
Spain. I was curious as to the process that happened in Barbados that led to the government deciding to take the side of reparation. I'm curious about that because on the African continent, apart from those of us who are struggling on the outside, we do not really see a wholesale movement from government. So I'm just wondering about that process so we can implement that. And when you talked about the code that was, the act that was put in place after emancipation, I'm reminded of the fact that in Canada currently we have migrant labor laws where the migrant workers, a lot of them from the Caribbean, are owned by whoever they work for. That is the law in Canada today. So I'm wondering if there's any discussion in CARICOM to actually deal with that, because those negotiations are done between the Canadian government and the different governments from CARICOM. And we have people from all over working on the farms here in Nova Scotia who are basically enslaved.
Thank you, Lisa. Denise? I wanted to ask about ways in which to articulate within the community that the enslavement of our people was a crime against humanity. My experience says that we understand other communities have experienced crimes against humanity, but somehow the enslavement of people, of our people, is not seen by ourselves as a crime against humanity. And I wanted to tie that question in terms of strategies to lift that experience as a crime against humanity with that of self-repair. So I wondered if in some of the things that are happening around the world, if somehow there's a linkage between understanding enslavement of African peoples as a crime against humanity with our self-repair. You take one more?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you very much, sir, for providing us with this understanding. And it's more a question whether or not we're looking at the actual trading families, the great families that were involved in the trade, and that perhaps some of the responses from governments is that perhaps is not the governments of the various other countries that benefited, but specifically families, and as they go, of course, to make up the family. And you could start with the House of Windsor, for example. Great trading families. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Appeal to their conscience. You're right when you say that there's no conscience. In fact, the British Prime Minister David Cameron came to the Caribbean, and we asked him about reparations, and he was totally dismissive. He said, that was a long time ago, that we should get over it, that the Caribbean, the black people of the Caribbean, should get over slavery. And he offered, we were asking for reparations, and he made an offer of a prison, that he would give us resources to build a prison to house criminals deported from Britain. So how insensitive. To be fair, no, let me be absolutely fair. He also offered a $300 million fund, like an aid package of. See, he offered the prison. He offered a $300 million aid package, and said to the Caribbean people that they need to get over slavery, and it's so long ago. Then a few months later, we discovered that the British Treasury was still paying the bonds that they had taken out to pay the 20 million pounds in 1834. That the last payment on those bonds was in February of 2015. So what he was claiming was ancient history. They were still paying the debt on the bonds as recently as February of 2015. Anyway, that doesn't really answer your question. So yes, we know that that there's no real conscience there, and so we know that they have to be pushed, screaming. They have to be pushed to do the right thing. And I think that we have to use as our model the anti-apartheid movement. We have to look at the anti-apartheid movement as a model for the kind of movement we have to build. So we have to put tremendous pressure on them. We have to sow bring world public opinion to our side, that we create a situation where wherever any of these European or North American statesmen go in the world, people are asking them, but what about the debt you owe to the African people? When is it going to be paid? So yes, it can't be about appealing to their conscience. Fundamentally, we are basing our claim on international law, that a crime was committed, and under international law, you must pay. And we have to isolate them. We have to bring world public opinion to our side. We have to bring the broad masses of humanity on our side and critique them and isolate them, embarrass them, really put the pressure on them. And ultimately, if it has to come to where you actually prosecute the case in the court of law, we need to do so. But we don't want to run into a court prematurely and have it be their court that they dominate. You understand? So you may eventually have to get to that situation of a court. But for me, that comes after a whole process of building a coalition, of diplomacy, of critiquing them, really pushing them on the back foot, embarrassing them, and so forth. African countries give us resources for our reparations struggle. That's not going to happen. In fact, one of the good things about the CARICOM initiative, and I'm saying that CARICOM needs now to reach out to Africa. We have seen this before, right? At the World Conference Against Racism, Africa was with us. In all the preparatory stages, Africa worked with us, putting together these reparations resolutions and fighting to put reparations on the agenda. I know because I worked with many of their diplomats in Geneva. They were committed to it. But by the time we got to Durban, the Western powers had so intimidated the African leaders that most of the African leaders backed away. I remember the Nigerian ambassador approaching me with tears in his eyes and apologizing to me for what had happened, because the Nigerian president sold out our cause at Durban, and several of the African leaders. But they had given in. It's not that they wanted to do it. Somehow they didn't have within them the same strength that the Caribbean governments had. And they buckled to the threats and the intimidation and the pressure. And I remember meeting with the South African Minister of Foreign Affairs, because we were insisting on these things, and there was a saying, well, we are putting the conference in jeopardy because the conference could end in failure if there's no resolution, and then it's an embarrassment for South Africa, the host nation. So I went to meet with her. Because at that time I was leading the Caribbean delegation. Hilary Beckles had left by then. And I told her, look, we don't want to cause any problems for South Africa, but the reality is we are here representing 500 years of history. We cannot compromise on 500 years of suffering, what our people went through. So you just have to understand that. So the point is, we have seen how African leaders have buckled under the threats and the pressure. But we know that there is strength in numbers. There's strength in a collective position. So it is my hope that as CARICOM solidifies its campaign, that we reach out to Africa and we say to our continental brothers, look, we can do this thing together. If we do it together, they can't divide and rule. They can't isolate us and pick off and threaten and victimize. We do it together. So I think that actually is our best hope, that we need to bring Africa on board with us. But we are the ones that are going to need to reach out. But once Africa comes on board, then our campaign becomes so much more powerful. Yes. And then we go forward with much more power and resources behind us. How did Barbados? Well, Barbados, people like myself, we were there pushing the Barbados government for many years. As I said, Barbados set up the National Task Force before the CARICOM made the decision. And truth be told, we in Barbados, we were the ones who proposed this CARICOM Reparations Commission. And I was the one who actually sketched the initial sketch, and we put it forward. Other people then ran with it. Prime ministers ran with it. And so, you know, I don't have any problems with that, because a prime minister is able to get done what I was hoping that we could get it done. But a prime minister takes it up and runs with it and accomplishes it. I am happy, because I was only hoping it could be done. It was done. The prime minister got it done. So you know, the Canadian Farm Labor Scheme, I'm glad you mentioned that to me. We have never looked at it that critically. Maybe we need to pay more attention to exactly what happens in that scheme. So I would definitely make it a point of duty to look more closely into the conditions in that scheme. Crime against the information about the crimes against humanity. Well, the truth is that it is only now that we are getting our own indigenous historians, people like Professor Beckles, for example, doing the research, writing the books. Before, in the Caribbean, I can speak about the Caribbean, we had a whole set of colonial historians that wrote about the history from the perspective of the colonizer, and papered over the profound depravity and evil and suffering. It is only now that it has really begun to be laid bare. Not just the profound human suffering, but also the extent to which that whole early capitalist development was constructed. And that process of exploitation of human labor was constructed in places like Barbados and Jamaica and the other Caribbean islands. So I would say that we are now really having the material to hand that we can use to truly inform and educate our people. So part of the reason that we might not have been very successful in the past is that we just did not have the material available to us. But it certainly exists now. And so we need to use it and deploy it. And it's just not history books. Poets and filmmakers, you know, that poem this evening, I mean, that was so powerful, right? And so we have to bring, I see a big role for our artists, you know, a big role for our artists in that whole process of educating our people about that history. And you were asking if evidence of exploitation today could be used as an example. The truth is, when you really look at what our ancestors went through, I don't know that there's any example of current day exploitation. I mean, the only thing comparable is the genocide inflicted on the indigenous people. That's the only thing that is comparable. But go and do the research and reading for yourself. I mean, it was horrendous. It was horrendous what was done to, you know, Hilary Beckles says that he has discovered in the historical records no less than 10,000 ways to kill an African. No less than 10,000. I mean, from putting the body in molasses and putting you up there to be eaten by ants and insects, to burning at the stake, to successive mutilations. I mean, you name it, you name it. Put spotlight on the trade in families, yes. I think that we have to ultimately get to the governments, but there's a process. And part of the process in getting to the governments is first to get to the companies and the institutions. So families, the Barclays family, Bering's family, you know, many of the banking families, the family fortunes were built on investing in the slave trade. So we can find the families, we can find the Wells Fargo Bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, you know, many institutions we can we can put our finger on, and we can target them not only with law cases, but with consumer boycotts and other forms of activism. And that will lead us in the right direction to the ultimate reckoning, which must take into account national governments. Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Just some presents
Thank you.
for you,
Okay.
which we'll tell you about in a moment. And please join me again in thanking David Combs.
Appreciate it. What's up, man? Let's see what's.
Don't
Okay.
forget to buy a book. $13
Probably.
Oh, yeah. So this is, of course, about Rocky. And
I met him once or twice
yes.
back in the day.
Yeah, and this, I just thought that you might enjoy this because this is actually, the composer is Maliseet. The Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet are the two primary indigenous people in this area.
Okay.
And what this is he's a composer, but he's taken archival recordings of